How's everyone? Appreciate you for coming out this evening, and I wanted to welcome you to the Savings for College, Managing Retirement Wealth through the Darien Library. We want to thank the Darien Library for letting us participate. And this evening I'm hoping to give you a little bit of insight into some of the issues surrounding savings for college, as well as a little bit of insight as to how the process is designed with reference to perhaps the opportunity to take advantage of federal financial aid either through federal grants, federal loans, or other alternatives that are available to you. So as we proceed, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to ask. I'm happy to answer anything that I can. And I also just wanted to introduce two gentlemen who actually are in the Connecticut area. I'm out of the Philadelphia office, and Jeff Behringer and Mr. Weinstock. So I want to thank them for letting me come up today and bend your ear, if I may. So when I generally begin to talk about these things, we're always talking about money, and it always relates to many of you in this room may not be old enough to know Oscar Wilde, but Oscar Wilde was a great philanthropist, and one of his famous sayings was, when I was young, I used to think money was the most important thing in the world. Now that I'm old, I know it is. I might arrange that a little bit differently now that I have two children in college. I can vouch for that money is an important component, because we have the capacity to help our children, educate them, and my role is we educate them. So you pick your kids' education very, very carefully, because they'll be picking your nursing home. Just keep that in mind. In this particular area, I did a little research on the internet, and a couple of the facts that I discovered in this particular arena. There are a lot of children who do go forward to college after they leave high school. New Canaan School District, I was told, per the information I received, about 95.4% of the student body goes on to higher education. And in Darien, it's a little bit higher, 96.7%. Of course, that's why you're all here, because Darien school systems. And Stanford, West Hill indicated about 95% of the student body went on to education. And it's clear that most people today, it's just assumed that you're going to go on to college, because if you don't, the alternatives are perhaps lessened. I always joke with my children when my daughter tells me, "Dad, this is just too hard. I don't want to continue to do this anymore." I said, "That's okay, as long as you can say a few words." She said, "What's that?" I said, "Do you want fries with that?" But she doesn't think that's funny. I get a kick out of it. So we have a large percentage of the population, student population, who do move on to college. And not surprising, I'm sure many of you find that college is not inexpensive. These are national averages, not necessarily specifically in this area, but the average public institution in-state is now $21,447. That's supposedly including books, transportation, and other expenses, fees and dues. Public institutions out of state of almost $34,000. Private schools, $42,224, and Ivy League schools, $55,500. Again, on average. I graduated from Susquehanna University in 1980. And I recall my final year was about $8,500 a year for total tuition, room, and board. And today it's $51,000 a year. So people say it's just impossible. The cost can't keep going up, but it does. And for those of you who might have had the honor of having children very recently, 18 years from now, when they're ready for their first year of college, this is the national average. About 6% increases per year. You can expect in-state first year tuition, $61,000. Public school, $96,900. Ivy League, $158,000. It doesn't sound reasonable or it doesn't sound feasible, but again, when you look back to when you graduated college, Look at what the fees were at that time. Look at what they are today. And those, unfortunately, are numbers that have actually been occurring from the past to the present. 6% to 7% is the historical norm. Just if it's not depressing enough, I calculated what the 4 years would cost in an Ivy League school with a continual 6% inflation rate each year, and the grand total would be about $693,000. Just keep that in the back of your minds. And that's, remember, those are national averages. Let's take a peek at some of the more highly rated schools. Sarah Lawrence, just down the street, not too far, Westchester, New York, $59,160. A little closer to home for you, Wesleyan, $56,000. Trinity, not far behind at number 12, at $55,450. So these are real numbers. These are what colleges are costing us today. And interestingly enough, Discoverer Cards Financial Services recently did a study that suggested that 75% of U.S. parents wanted to aid their children with college funding, but were worried that they weren't going to be able to come up with the money. 81% of those parents polled stated that for their college-bound children between the ages of 16 and 18, that they felt college was very, very important. So the question is, how do you pay for this? Well, I can tell you that what's been happening recently is people are borrowing, and borrowing big. For the first time in history, in 2011, college debt has exceeded $1 trillion. Approximately, according to the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau, $864 billion of that is in federal government student loans and $150 billion in private student debt. So for the first time in history, student debt has exceeded consumer credit debt, consumer card credit debt. And you can see USA Today reported in 2011 as well that borrowing is twice people borrow twice what they did a decade ago after adjusting for inflation, and the total outstanding debt has doubled in the past 5 years. So people are borrowing to pay for these large outlays of expense, and they're doing it predominantly through student loans, or a large part through student loans or student borrowing. The other component of this, and I've been with this firm for almost 27 years, and my primary role has always been in estate and financial planning. And the issue people always suggest is that one of the most important keys in their financial picture is to make sure that they can educate their children. The problem is, however, is we can't forget about the fact that we too would like someday to retire. Ultimately, what I find is people's expectation is I'll get the kids through school, then I'll choose to retire, I'll start saving for retirement after that, and I'll be okay. The problem is in our environment with the economy the way it is, we do find sometimes early termination comes about from an employment and just don't have the ability to continue to save. I've witnessed a fair number of individuals who have been downsized, I believe that's the proper euphemism these days, and ultimately they have not been able to replace the levels of income that they had grown accustomed to. I also find that sometimes we are the sandwich generation. Not only are we supporting our children, but in many instances we are responsible for our parents as well. That too can be a considerable drain on our resources. So the issues are, you can't forget about the retirement component of this. Interestingly enough, Money Magazine a while ago did a survey, or actually reported on a survey that was done by the Boston College Center. And this survey study indicated that for retirement research found that some 35% of early boomers, those born between 1946 and 1954, may not be able to sustain their standard of living in retirement. And for those born between 1955 and 1964, the tail end of the boomers, they figured that 44% of that population was not going to be able to retire comfortably in the standard of living they were accustomed to. So when we're faced with these two issues, paying for our children's education and being able to save for retirement, it's a quandary. That study further went on to suggest that this is how much money you should be saving in order to achieve your retirement, your comfortable retirement. They were suggesting that by the time you attain age 45, you better have saved 4.1% of your income. So if you're making $100,000, you should have saved $410,000. By the time you attain age 50, you better have $610,000 saved. By the time you're 55, $850. And by the time you're 65, about $1.5 million in order to maintain your comfortable retirement. Fortunately, I feel much better because Fidelity, our friends Fidelity Investment Company, just came out with a new study last week that said by the time I'm 67, I only need 8 times my salary. So a little less impinging on these assets. However, I would suggest that this study and Fidelity's study, the exact numerators and returns were not identical. So this was done a couple of years ago when the markets were kind of hurling along, and Fidelity's probably using significantly lower expected returns. But those are serious numbers to be able to put away enough money to meet your retirement. And again, as we just saw, what the expense is to meet our children's education. So it's a paradox. How do I do both? How do I achieve retirement and how do I pay for my kids' expenses? So I don't think there's really a right answer. In our presentations to our clients, what we try to do is to help them balance those two components. We recognize that they are both very, very important components. And I always say that they generally don't allow you to borrow to retire, but they do allow you to borrow to send your kids through school. So it's something that we try to balance out. And although everybody asks, I'm a WPTCIC, which means parent with 2 kids in college, I don't have all the answers either. But I do know that I'm only 5 payments away from seeing light at the end of the tunnel with no more college tuitions due. But I'm not there yet. So how do we pay for it? Well, there's really 4 basic opportunities. You either pay as you go, you borrow to meet those expenses, scholarships and grants, or financial aid. I'm going to talk a little bit about each of these 4 topics in a little further detail. The pay-as-you-go plan, your money either comes from cash flow for parents or grandparents. For some individuals who have high income earnings, the ability to meet those college costs out of cash flow, not a problem. But that's not the case for everyone. And I also remind people, don't be disillusioned. Income is not wealth. And what I mean by that is employment can be terminated, either through loss of job, death, disability. So if you're planning on using that cash flow to pay for your children's education, you can't always guarantee that that cash flow will be there. So that is something that we have to keep in mind. The other component of this is money comes from parents or grandparents. Out of the assets for our parents or grandparents. And I think the issue here is what we have to try to do, of course, is to generate the resources to be able to do that. When we talk about having assets to be used for college expenses, going back to that cost of what an Ivy League school is. For an individual who was born today, if you think about what will it require to save on a monthly basis to meet that need, I did a little calculations, and if that individual was born today, we'd have to save $1,884 a month until they begin school to be able to meet that $639,000 liability we're talking about. The issues are start early and invest often. Because if you delayed that savings program by just 4 years, rather than $1,800 a month, so if your child is now 4 years old and you haven't begun to put anything away, you're now going to have to save $2,700 a month to meet the same liability. Not surprising, if you wait till they're 8 years old, you're going to have to save $4,300 a month to meet the same objective. So it is important to begin early, save as much as you can, and ultimately what I say to people is it's never too late to start. I mean, having some component of it is very, very important, because the assets that we do save means less that has to be borrowed later on. I have also seen a very, very strong change in some of the choices that families are making with where their children are going to attend. Again, I graduated high school in 1976. I chose to go to a school called Susquehanna University, and I recall many of my friends were choosing private schools as well, and not as many people elected to go to state schools. The reputation wasn't quite as great as the private schools, but I know the educations were equally as good. On the same side of the equation today, I find that both of my children have elected to go to state schools, and not that I entice them by buying them a car or anything like that. However, the ability to get into state schools, the bar has been raised significantly, because the costs of the private schools has risen so rapidly that there is a significant more applicants to the state schools simply because of cost. So your student has to maintain strong academic capabilities to be able to get into their schools of choice, wherever that is. But being able to save to meet those objectives has to begin very, very early. The other alternatives are students pay. You work while you're at school and pay for school. It's certainly, a lot of people do it. I worked when I was in school, not to cover my entire cost, but certainly to cover many of my expenses, and part of that. When I got out back in 1980, I think I had a 3% student loan and a $10,000 balance, which was astronomical to me. But today that's one semester at some institutions. So those are options. The other alternative is maybe the student pays some, maybe the parent pays some, and the reality of it is it'll be a combination of all four of those. It'll probably be part of an income flow from parents' income. It'll be part of a use of their assets that they've saved for the child's education. Maybe the student does work a little bit, and ultimately we see a combination of parents and students using assets and income to meet those objectives. As they say, having a little skin in the game often makes them feel a little bit more compelled to work and study a little harder. The alternatives, when we come talk about borrowing money for the use of school, there's basically two types: government-backed loans and private loans. If any of you have dove into the capacity to borrow, there's basically two types. We have Stafford loans, and there are Stafford subsidized loans, and there are Stafford loans that are unsubsidized. The subsidized loans basically mean that when you borrow the money, you really don't start accruing the interest until you graduate or fall to a position where you're taking classes at less than a half-time student. So those Stafford loans are what we deem subsidized. So you borrow the money, the interest doesn't begin to accrue until after you either graduate or stop attending school at something less than half-time. And the rates on those today are 3.4%. The unsubsidized, not surprising, take out the loan at the disbursement, interest begins accruing immediately, although payments don't start until you, again, either graduate or stop attending school, at least at a half-time basis. Perkins loans, a little bit more favorable, and parent or graduate plus loans. And a little bit greater clarification, I think all of you can read this. At the very top, I talk about the Stafford loans. We'll see it's divided into two categories. We have what we call dependent students and independent students. Dependent student is someone who's being claimed on their parents' income tax return, and they are permitted in their first year, their freshman year of school. They can borrow up to $5,500 that year. $3,500 would come in subsidized basis, and then the other 2,000 would come from unsubsidized. Remember, these are subsidized loans are always needs-based loans. So they're always going to be dependent upon the financial need of the student. We're going to talk a little bit more detail about that as well. In your second year, you can borrow $6,500, $4,500 of it being subsidized, $2,000 unsubsidized, and then your junior and senior year up to $7,500, and then a lifetime limit of $31,000. And then for undergraduate independent students, those who are not claimed as dependents on their parents' income tax return, you can see that the gifting is the borrowing capacity is a little bit higher, but the interest rate is significantly higher too, which is kind of amazing today in an environment where we're getting 0.0001 on our money market accounts, and the Fed's lending money out at 6.8%. Seems to be a little bit of a disconnect, but those are the rates for the 2011-2012 academic year. And if you elect to continue to go on to graduate school, we can still continue with Stafford loans, again subsidized and unsubsidized. You can see the limits, a lifetime limit of $138,000. And if you elect to go on to be in the health profession, a doctor or something of that nature, you can borrow as much as $224,000, which certainly gives you a fairly sizable liability when you're through with your medical school. Perkins loans are probably one of the more attractive because of the interest rate. They're at only 5%. And the figure on here states that you could borrow up to $4,000 per year for undergraduate. It's actually been increased to $5,500 for the 2011-2012 scholastic year. And similarly, your graduate lifetime limit is $60,000. Almost all of these loans give you the ability to pay back over a 10-year time period. And there is something called a consolidation, that if you begin to consolidate your loans, it might be feasible to stretch out your payment period for as much as 30 years. And then many of you may have heard, we were discussing it a little bit earlier this evening, that there's been some suggestions of student loan forgiveness in the future. To my knowledge, that has not become law, but it is something that they're talking about. If your student loans aren't paid off within a 20-year time period, they'll simply forgive them. I'll leave political comment to the side, and that's just what they're talking about in an effort to help students reduce some of this loan. Because think about it, when we come out with such excessive debt levels, it minimizes their ability to purchase homes, minimizes their ability to begin families. So it really does have a potentially stifling effect on their ability to begin life. But I suppose we were all there. We overcame it somehow. But nevertheless, the costs today have grown immensely, and they only seem to continue to get worse. The only other note that I would make is they do have loans for parents. If your children have tapped out and there's still a need for additional resources, plus loans are made directly to the parents, not to the students. 7.9% is the current rate. And there's no limit on what you can borrow other than what the child's educational costs are. So there's a fair degree of opportunity to borrow. Many of them, remember that the subsidized are all needs-based borrowing. Unsubsidized, pretty much anybody who applies would be entitled to them. The other alternative is if you had either exhausted all of the ability or didn't qualify for the subsidized loans federally. Alternatives that people have relied on: remortgaging their homes. In this environment, when a 30-year mortgage is less than 3% in some instances, it's certainly an inexpensive means to acquire money to help pay for school. But you must also keep in mind that when you're putting a lien against your property, your house is up to the task if repayment of that loan can't be continued for loss of income or illness or sickness. So there are things to give consideration to. I always say don't let the tax tail wag the dog, and there's also some discussions now on limitations of how much you would be able to write off as an itemized deduction on your home mortgage interest. So it may not be as appealing as we move forward as it is today. Similarly, home equity loans are also a source that people use to assist in the payment. Private student loans, just as we talked about the federally backed student loans, many banking institutions and lending institutions also offer private student loans at whatever comparable rates are at this time. And then also, the personal loan is just a signature guarantee which provides a source of income as well. A lot of people might think that they would like to rely on scholarships. What I would say to you is that based on the information from the College Board, grants represent only about 28% of the federal financial aid. So with the numbers, it represents about $42 billion of the $147 billion that's being given out on an annual basis. And another $97 billion of that was coming from government loans. So grants are actually are fairly difficult. They are also all needs-based. And the opportunity for those is going to be predicated on a number of issues. Parents' income, parents' assets, children's income. But there are basically two forms of grants that we have. One is called the Pell Grant. Pell Grants, again, are needs-based. They allow about $5,500 a year for the Pell Grant. Everything that you would attempt to apply for all goes through one basic form called the FAFSA, the Free Financial Aid Form. The institution that your child attends is effectively the individuals that determine the formula of how much each family would be entitled to. And I'm going to look at a little bit more detail about some of the components of that. But we have two basic types of grants, the Pell Grants and the Federal Supplemental Educational Opportunity Grants. Again, also needs-based. They allow $5,500 an academic year for undergraduates and $8,000 a year for graduate students. But all needs-based, predominantly on income, assets, and the cost of the institution the child attends. The other components of financial aid come really in two forms. One is merit, which is either a scholarship, whether it be an athletic scholarship, an educational scholarship, an aptitude scholarship, music, athletics. All of those are predicated on your children's skills and abilities. So I would strongly urge you, when they're little, start fostering those opportunities so we can get them to great institutions with free rides. However, I was a runner, but it never really helped me terribly with scholastics. It just afforded me some very, very low rate interest on my student loans. Nevertheless, financial needs base, what your child is entitled to from a financial needs base is based on these three basic components. The cost of the institution that they're attending, and in our world it's called, we call it the COA, if you will, which is the cost of attendance. The other component is, from that cost of attendance, we subtract resources that are provided to the child. Resources could be scholarships. Resources could be money that's paid directly to the institution by grandparents or employers. Keep in mind that individuals have the capacity. Typically, you're familiar with the fact that you're allowed to give anyone you choose $13,000 per person per year. So grandparents often make gifts to their grandchildren at $13,000 a year. One of the caveats states that as long as you are paying tuition of your grandchild directly to the institution that they're attending, you're permitted to exceed that $13,000 level without incurring a gift tax liability. The other caveat is you can pay for medical expenses as well, and it doesn't become an issue of exceeding that $13,000. Well, if your grandparent is paying directly to the institution to help pay for part of your education, that's deemed a resource. And it then reduces the cost of attendance. Not surprising, dollar for dollar. So if you're at a private school that's costing $55,000, that's your cost of attendance. From that, you would subtract any scholarships or payments that are being made by either grandparents. Employers often will help with paying for some of your educational expense. And then we have expected family contribution. This is essentially what the college boards, what the federal government expects the family to be able to pay as part of meeting that cost of the college. This graph, which I'm about to show you, is not exact, it's just an example of what hypothetically a family would be expected to pay. So if you look at in the far left column, it's what is someone's adjusted gross income. So for example, $50,000. Each of the successive columns is how many dependent children you have attending college at that time. So if your adjusted gross income is $50,000 in this example, your expected contribution, the family contribution, is expected to be roughly $3,776. So in my example, if you're attending a university that costs $25,000 and the resources that have been provided, maybe your child received a $1,000 scholarship from your employer, and then if your expected family contribution was $3,776, when I subtract those figures from the cost of attendance, that's hypothetically the financial aid package that the school would try to fill through a combination of grants, loans, private borrowing, or federal borrowing. So this EFC is a very, very important number. So when we have an institution, again, you're attending an Ivy League school, the cost of participating, the cost of association, the cost of participating is very, very high. For a public school, not surprising, the cost of attendance is much less. Therefore, we would anticipate that attending a private school, your financial need package would generally be larger. Unfortunately, if we look at it as an example, if I go to $100,000 and I have one child at school, where expected family contribution is $18,000. Each of the columns that follow, so if I have two children in school, my family contribution is $17,323. However, it's not per child. That figure is actually divided in two. And if I have 4 kids in school, my family contribution is $14,562 divided by 4. So this is an estimate of what we're looking at. And not surprising, as your income rises, your expected family contribution rises as well. So for a family that has an income of $200,000 with one child in school, their expected family contribution is about $49,000. So if your child is planning on participating or attending a public school that costs $22,000, your family contribution is supposed to be $49,000. Needless to say, your child would not be entitled to any kind of financial aid. They would expect you to pay for it out of pocket. So each of those, and those are approximate numbers. But that's not the only thing that determines your expected family contribution. There's 2 examples. On the left-hand side, we see parental income that's the same across the board for family A, B, and C. We have $60,000. But what else goes into this equation is also what assets a parent has. In this case, you can see Family A has no assets at all. Family B has $75,000 of investments. Family C has $150,000. They all three have the same income, but you can see the difference is in what the expected family contribution is. For the family that has no assets and $60,000 of income, their expected family contribution is $4,420. But for the family C, who has $150,000 of assets, their contribution is $4,300 more. They're expected to contribute $8,800. On the other side of the screen, we have a family who has all the same assets, $50,000, but their incomes are different. $60,000 for family D, $100,000 for family E, and $150,000 for family F. What you can take from this is income is actually a bigger factor than assets. And we often hear people say, oh, I need to hide my assets. If I'm going to get financial aid, I have to eliminate my assets. The reality of it is, in the financial aid calculation, they only expect a family to use roughly 5.64% of their assets. That doesn't include retirement accounts, doesn't include a house, would include a secondary property, but not your primary, doesn't generally include life insurance, and there's some questions of whether or not it includes annuities. So the issue is, from an income perspective, however, they would expect you to use up to 47% of your annual income to meet college costs. And that is, again, probably the bigger factor that people don't take into consideration, because that income figure is what really impacts the ability for financial aid. The child resources comes into play here as well. They use a flat figure of about 20% of the child's assets and 50% of a child's income. So if there are schemes in the British sense of ways of trying to avoid having the child's assets used so heavily. So many of our clients have UGMA accounts, Uniform Gift to Minors accounts, or Uniform Transfer to Minors accounts. In many instances, what we have suggested is moving those UGMA accounts into a UGMA 529, because there was a law enacted in 2010 that says even though it's the child's asset, which typically we would use 20% of, they've made a rule that states that the distributions from that 529 would only be deemed similar to a parent's asset. So they're only going to really use 5.64% of that UGMA account of the child's to be used in calculating the expected family contribution. So there are some opportunities to shift assets around legally without impeding or having those assets used as heavily. But I can't stress enough to you, it's not really the asset base that you have, it's really generally going to be more the income component that's going to preclude people from the ability to get financial aid. If I go back to my chart a moment ago, when we look at this, anyone who has an adjusted gross income in excess of between 180 and 190,000, between those levels of adjusted gross income, you are effectively going to be eliminating your capacity to qualify for needs-based financial aid, just making too much money based upon the standards. Not to suggest that you still have to pay your mortgage and pay your real estate taxes and feed your children and pay for your car insurance, but those are predominantly the way it strikes out on the formula and on the chart. Once you exceed that 180 level, often it's very difficult for you to achieve some type of needs-based financial aid. And today that's not quite as excessive as you might think. So aside from the financial aid ability and meeting your expected family contribution, when I recognize that many of our clients just don't have the ability to qualify for aid, now the alternatives are, well, what do we do to be able to save for school? Where do we put our money that's going to be the most effective and most productive in meeting college costs. So there's a couple of items here, and I'm going to run through them one by one, but basically I'm sure everyone's very familiar with 529 plans. 529 is a section code of the Internal Revenue Service. Each individual state has effectively drafted their own 529 program. Many of them have actually assigned mutual fund companies to go out and invest the money for their particular programs. We have, as I mentioned, uniform gift to minors accounts, Coverdale educational savings accounts, U.S. savings bonds, IRA accounts, and taxable accounts. But let me drop back just for a moment. 529s. Typically, the 529s come in two forms. One is a prepaid program. Many states have a program in which you effectively prepay at the cost of a college credit today, so that when your child is eligible to attend, and usually they would end up attending a state school, what you prepaid, those credits, are automatically applied to meeting the college cost based upon what the cost is at that time. Connecticut is not a state that has a prepaid program. Connecticut has what we call the investment program. I liken it to a 401k or a 403b with your employer. You put the money in, it's invested in a specific either strategy or methodology, and whatever the value of that account is when your child is ready to attend school is what you have available to meet that cost. The advantages of the 529, of course, are that the money that's in there, providing it's used for qualified higher educational expenses, comes out tax-free. Not only that, but if any of your children happen to create an online business and become multi-millionaires before they attend school and don't need this money, it can be passed along to other family members to be used in the same format, as long as it's for qualified higher educational expenses. The other component of that is that we've seen in many instances, if in fact I've seen the assets go unused because parents just actually ended up paying for it through cash flow, it's a resource that can be passed on to future generations. In some cases, it's passed on to grandchildren to be used later on. I always prefer to think of it as if I had one and my kids didn't use it all, then I would use it for something very, very useful like cooking classes in Italy. As long as it's an accredited school, you have the capacity to use that. But here in Connecticut, you have basically two ways of investing in the check program, what they call the check program. One is directly sold through Connecticut, and that's TIAA-CREF is the manager of that. The alternative is you can buy the check program through an advisor, a brokerage firm, or banking institution, and those funds are invested with Hartford Company. The advantage of investing in the check program as a Connecticut resident is that the contributions that you make in a tax year are deductible. The amount not to exceed $5,000 annually for single individuals and $10,000 for joint returns. So, and then typically when your child begins to attend school and the money comes out, it's used to directly pay for those college educational needs. I believe Connecticut gives you a favorable tax treatment on those as well. But as I mentioned, in some instances, you had a question earlier about if I have someone who's a grandson who doesn't live in Connecticut, does it make sense to buy the check program? As I said, each state has actually gone out and hired individual mutual fund companies to manage their state program. So my suggestion to you is to look at what the performance has been for the individual states, and you might want to then pick a 529 program for your grandchild based on performance rather than participating in the check program. And the other thing that I would add is that similar to shifting the UGMAs into a 529, it is not as favorable for a grandparent to own the 529 program rather than the parent, simply because, as I mentioned, when the money comes out of those, it's treated less favorably for financial aid purposes because it's then treated as the child's income, which they would use 20% of directly, rather than if it's in the name of the parent, it's just an asset, not an income source.
Can you just explain the benefits again of the check amount and the downside?
Sure. In general, 529s, when you make a contribution to a 529 program, the money is invested in a strategy. However, it grows completely free of tax. It's tax deferred, and providing the money comes out of the account and is used to meet specifically qualified higher education, something after high school, then the money comes out tax-free. And that's really the big advantage, is it's rather than having it subject to income tax and reducing what's available to be used to pay for college educations, the 529 programs allow those assets to grow completely tax-free.
So what were you saying the benefit of going outside of Connecticut would be?
In this gentleman's case, he has a grandchild who's not a Connecticut resident. So what often individuals do is, some cases, they look at the program that's offered by the state that they were a resident, and they look at a comparison of what has the performance of those investments been compared to a different state. But you may not get, in this case, if you were a resident of Connecticut and you chose to use American funds, and I think that they might have Rhode Island's 529 program, you won't get a deduction when you make a contribution, as it suggests at the bottom of this slide. However, if the performance, from a historical perspective, has been better than what the CHET program has offered, some people might consider investing in it, even though it's not as favorable from a tax perspective. And it's an issue of weighing performance. But this is a huge benefit. If you're making a contribution, reducing your Connecticut taxable income based on that contribution is very favorable. But I always say, don't let the tax tail wag the dog. Just make sure that the investment you're getting is the best performing for you, because ultimately it's what comes out at the end that counts the most. Coverdell IRAs were something that was employed several years ago, and they were designed, unlike 529s, which are used just for post-secondary education, those things that are just after high school. Coverdell IRAs were able to be used for any educational expense. So they were tools in which parents or grandparents could place resources, and then again with similar advantages from a tax perspective, meaning that they would grow tax deferred. We had the ability to take the money out and pay for whether it be private elementary school or private high schools. However, with the fiscal cliff that's facing all of us, the sunset provisions are changing the use of Coverdell IRAs significantly. So in 2012, you can use it for any educational need, starting theoretically, unless they change the tax law, beginning in 2013. You'll no longer have the ability to withdraw those tax-free to meet pre-secondary educational costs or pre-college costs. It'll only be for college expense. Secondly, the annual contribution was only $2,000, so we didn't see a lot of use of them. That, again, based upon current law in 2013, is actually going to be slated to be dropped to only $500 of annual contributions. So unless they can do something to dramatically change the Coverdell IRA, I have a feeling it'll go the way of the dinosaur. It'll just vanish. It's not as effective. Although, I mean, for some people, it's still an opportunity to help involve their children in these programs, and $500 is not, not a small sum, but it gives the children an opportunity to witness the growth of the investments and get a feel for how money is used to pay for costs. But I honestly don't anticipate significant changes, and I checked with some of our outside counsel. There's clearly no expectation for any changes until after the elections occur. And I don't think this will be one of the biggest proponents in the bills for them to change anything with. So I would anticipate that they're going to slip away, and we probably won't see much of them after this. I'd also state that we still have the ability of using savings bonds for college purposes. Typically, the savings bond actually has to be bought in the parent's name, not the student's name. And when they're redeemed, the interest is tax-free. However, there are caveats, and those caveats are typically based upon adjusted gross income. So for a single individual, there's a phase-out whether your income is between $71,100 and $86,100. Once your adjusted gross income exceeds $86,100, you're no longer eligible for that tax-free component of the redemption of the Series Z bonds. And for married individuals, it's phased out between $106,000 and $136,000. So, but it can be a very, very useful tool. The interest rates, of course, on fixed income investments like savings bonds is not astronomical at the moment. But if individuals have savings bonds that were bought years ago and it's in the parent name, then as long as you fall within those parameters, it's a nice resource to know that you can, in fact, use them to redeem them, exclude the income tax that's built up in them, and use them for college expenses. You also have the capacity to redeem Series E bonds and convert them to 529s, providing you fall within the similar parameters of an adjusted gross income component. So I know we have but again, it has to be in the parent. Actually, in some instances, we can take some of those old bonds that were in the children's name and possibly convert them. So it is a consideration, because I know we have a lot of them hanging around in drawers that we've kind of forgotten about, and they are significant resources. Anything that was bought prior to 1980, remember, you paid 3/4 of face value. Anything purchased after 1980, you paid 1/2 face value. So there actually is a resource on the internet. You can go to savingsbonds.org. And you can actually put in the purchase date, and it'll tell you what the value is today, what portion of that is interest, and what portion of that is return principal. It does add up considerably in many instances. IRA accounts, not an asset that I would highly recommend using to meet college costs, but as I said, we still have to balance savings with college costs. And one of the caveats of avoiding a 10% penalty of taking money out of an IRA prior to being 59.5 is to use those proceeds for the use of college. And it's generally to the extent of what the child's costs are. You're avoiding the 10% penalty, you're not avoiding the income tax on that. So remember that generally everything that comes out of an IRA account is subject to ordinary income taxes at your federal marginal rates. Unless you've made after-tax contributions in an IRA, then there's a formula to determine what portion's taxable, what's not. But this would afford you the ability to remove it from your IRA without incurring the 10% penalty. Again, my preference would be to use it as a last resource because it's expensive. You have to pay the income taxes. And then, of course, taxable accounts. I have to say that I personally used 529s, perhaps not to their fullest extent. What's the rule? That attorneys never have wills, cobblers' kids are always barefoot, and plumbers' pipes are always clogged. So I did not use 529s to the maximum. I chose instead to keep segregated accounts for my children so I had greater control over them and could use them if I needed to. But it is simply a resource. I always suggest you tag it and you create individual accounts, and as long as you begin your savings process as early as you possibly can, it's certainly going to be one of your greatest weapons in helping to meet those college costs. So I do highly recommend beginning any type of program is always going to be an advantage. And of course, you don't want to forget taking advantage of the credits, the opportunity credits that we have available to us. The one on the left, the American Opportunity, used to be referred to as the HOPE credit. It's now the American Opportunities credit. Again, generally these are all, whether or not you're entitled to take advantage of them, they're all going to be predicated on adjusted gross income. So similarly, when your modified adjusted gross income exceeds $80,000 to $90,000 with a single individual, or 160 to 180, you can't claim the credit once you exceed those limits. The lifetime learning credit is phased out, again, similarly 80 to 90, 160 to 180. Once you exceed those limits, you're no longer capable of using those either. But when you conduct or construct your 1040, your income tax return, this is actually a component of where that would be taken. So remember, credits are very, very effective. A credit is the actual reduction of the tax liability itself. It's not simply reducing your taxable income and saving that at whatever your federal marginal bracket is. It's actually the calculation of your income tax liability and actually a reduction for that. So the reduction is, your credit, the maximum credit is $2,000 on the American Opportunities, and 20% of qualified expenses up to $10,000 for a maximum of $2,000 credit on the lifetime learning credit side as well. We presently still have a couple of other options available to us as well, and that's really reflecting the some of the tuition reimbursement opportunities that individuals have. That can be up to a $4,000 credit, and also student loan interest is still deductible, again, within parameters of your adjusted gross income. So many of these items we tend to neglect. We don't take advantage of them. And as long as you fit within the parameters of adjusted gross income, these are things that shouldn't be overlooked, because they are, every dollar helps when we're trying to achieve those income needs. It's kind of a broad spectrum of the different components of what I think is information that you'll need to know as you move forward. And as again, I stress, everything begins with that FAFSA form. And when your child is ready to attend school, you will be required to fill that out, and that's what's going to be the determining factor of what financial aid, what grants, what credits, and specifically what your expected family contribution is going to be. But it is, there is light at the end of the tunnel. Generally, it's a 4-year program. We were discussing what % of kids today extend that to a 5-year program, and I think it's growing. I think the institutions sometimes make it difficult for children to complete their coursework at the timing of when the classes are provided. So I urge you, as a parent who's been through this, make sure you're quasi-involved in your children's ability to speak with their advisors and plot their courses. Again, I think it's imperative, and I joke, but I think today it's a necessity. When I went to school, getting a college education was something that was needed. Today, not only do we need undergraduate work, but it's almost expected today that our children will go on to graduate and perhaps even in master's, doctorates, and sky is the limit. But I tell them after their 4 or 5 years of college, they should get a job and let their employer pay for it. I thank you very much. I'll be happy to entertain any questions you might have. And I appreciate your time.